Hi everyone, it's Joe from Homegrown Musician and welcome back to... Nah, this isn't right. One sec, give me a minute. Much better. So from the top, hi everyone, my name's Joe from Homegrown Musician and welcome back to another video. So very recently, me and a good friend of mine, Ollie, made a little funk jam that went up on his Instagram page and I'll link to that down below. Now I really enjoyed doing this little project because I've got very little else to do because of coronavirus, and I thought it'd be a good idea to do a little musical analysis kind of breakdown video. So it's in the style of Fearless Flyers, Vulfpeck, modern day funk music. So if you're into that, I'll show you how we went about making the jam, the sort of musical ideas that were going through our heads, and maybe you can try them out for yourself in your own music. So before you can break it down, it only makes sense to listen to it. So here's our jam in full. So some of you die-hard Homegrown Musician fans out there, because I know you exist, might actually recognise Ollie's face. So he was in one of my very first videos all about home recordings and he supplied some didgeridoo for us. Now Ollie's a man of many talents, he's a great composer and he basically wrote the entire jam. I only added the guitar parts. So I thought, why don't I get Ollie to come on, talk about his musical approach, some of the ideas that he had, be great. Now, unfortunately, I've got some bad news. So about 7 years ago, Ollie was in a really bad accident where he was hit round the head with a grand piano at full speed. Terrible, terrible accident. He hasn't said a word to anyone since, and he only speaks in jazz licks. Now, luckily for you, I am semi-fluent in riff, so I might be able to understand what he's saying. So firstly, I asked Ollie about his choice of harmony, or in other terms, why he used the notes that he did. So when I started writing this track, I was listening to a lot of Fearless Flyers, Louis Cole, Vulfpeck, that sort of, modern day funk stuff, so I knew I wanted to write something similar. Now I know a lot of these bands use the Mixolydian scale, which is like the major scale but with this really cool flattened seventh, so I decided to use that. I also noticed that most of their melodies have both a minor and a major third, which gives them this really jagged bluesy edge, so I decided to throw that in there too. Thanks, Ollie. Very insightful. So firstly, I just want to focus on what Ollie said about the music being Mixolydian. Now, most popular music is either in a major key or in a minor key. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about keys because I have already made a video about them, so if you don't know anything about keys, just link below. So just like major and minor, all Mixolydian is a scale. So it sounds scary because it's got a long name, but nothing to worry about. However, it uses different intervals, so like major is different to minor, to give it a very specific character or sound. Now it's not used particularly frequently in pop music, but it is used all the time in classic rock and funk music. So a really good example of the Mixolydian mode in action is Ace of Aces by the Fearless Flyers. So the Mixolydian scale is probably most similar to the major scale, and Ollie's piece is actually in G Mixolydian, so we'll use that as our real world example. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a G note and build a major scale starting from that. Once you've done that, go to the final note in the scale, the F sharp, and flatten it by one semitone. Now this should give you a flattened seventh, which is the key note in a Mixolydian scale, and that's it, you've actually got G Mixolydian. So now that we've got our Mixolydian scale, if you start playing melodies or building chords only using those notes, it'll sound Mixolydian, and that is exactly what Ollie does. So his melody starts on a G, and almost all of the notes after that are from the G Mixolydian scale, which is why it sounds so funky and cool. The chords that he uses in the first section are G major and F major. Again, both are found in the Mixolydian scale. If we go to the last section, he uses C major, G major, and F major, and very importantly, he finishes on a big G major chord, which is why the piece overall sounds G Mixolydian. So now we understand Ollie's note choice a bit more. What's he talking about when he says using both a minor third and a major third? So to understand that, we'll have to take another look at our key, G mixolydian. So the distance between the very first note, G, and the third note, B, is a major third. So we can clearly see where Ollie's got this major third idea from, but what's he on about when he says minor third? So if we take a look in the melody, Ollie frequently uses the note B flat, which is a semitone below B and a minor third away from G, which is what he means when he says hopping between minor third and major third. Now if you play G, B flat and B all together at the same time on a piano, you get this... Yeah, it's not very nice, is it? So why doesn't Ollie's music sound that aggressive? Now the reason is because the B flat only comes in a few times, it's very fleeting, and even when it does, it doesn't stick around for very long. It's what's known as a chromatic passing note. So the idea is that you have all of these notes in G mixolydian, and you take notes from outside of the key and drop them into the melody, just very quickly, and then slide to a note that's back in the key. So this is used all the time in jazz and funk, just to spice melodies up and keep them a bit more interesting, and Ollie does this really well. So a really good example of this in practice is Assassin by the Fearless Flyers, and it's the reason the melody in that track kind of feels quite flowing and all over the place, but in a good way. So Ollie, can you tell us about your rhythmic approach? So when writing the melody, I ended up using a lot of syncopation. Now this wasn't intentional, it just comes with the territory of writing funk music. Now syncopation is where many of the notes of the melody don't fall on the strong rhythmic beats, so like 1 and 3. This effect is made even more obvious by the fact that the drums are playing a pretty tight 1 and 3 groove, which the melody is obviously going against. So just like Ollie says, rhythm and funk, they go hand in hand, and it's syncopation that gives, well, funk its funk. It's what makes it feel groovy. So if you're looking for a definition, syncopation is where the notes in, say, a melody or a riff fall in between the space that's left by the strong beats. So I'll give you a quick example of how that sounds. So if I say, this falls on the beat, this falls on the beat, you can clearly hear that my words line up with the hand claps. Now a syncopated version would be something like this. This falls on the beat. This falls on the beat. And only the last word that I say actually lines up with the claps. All of the others fit in with the space in between the claps. So Ollie's melody actually does this really well. It starts on an upbeat, so in the space before the very first beat, and a lot of the notes throughout the melody accent space in between the beats, so it feels really funky and syncopated, and it just really gets the whole vibe of the genre. Now here's another really quick example of something I've written myself, again just to really help drive home the concept of syncopation. So finally, what about the ensemble? What kind of instruments did you use? Before I'd even written a note for the piece, I already knew the rough instrumentation that I wanted to use. I knew I wanted a clean Strat style guitar, which is why I asked Joe if he'd like to help out, a smooth Hammond organ for melodies, a tight Fender jazz bass for those nice walking lines, and a classic drum kit. No double pedals or 37 toms for solos here. Whilst I'm all open for experimenting, if you're aiming for a very classic sound, sometimes playing it safe's the way to go. So whilst it might seem blindingly obvious to most people, instrumentation is probably the most important point on this list. And just to prove that, I'm going to take the melody that Ollie was jamming away on the Hammond, I'm going to stick it into Ableton because I can't play the keyboard properly, and I'm going to run it through the most inappropriate synth that I can find. So at best, that could be described as interesting, and it just kind of proves the point. Experimentation is really good fun, and wacky sound design is great and all, but if you are aiming for a very traditional specific sound, sometimes just choosing something that's appropriate is the best way to go. So when I was writing the guitar parts, for example, I had a look at other famous funk guitarists. So for example, Nile Rodgers, Corey Wong, and they both play Strat style guitars, or at least predominantly. So I grabbed my Strat, it's an Ibanez, but it's a Strat, and I used the second and fourth pickup positions as it gives you that really traditional quacky funk tone. I then ran it through a clean patch on my Kemper because I didn't want loads of distortion, and I made sure to use a lot of left hand muting as it adds ghost notes and help make things feel funky. So this same principle applies to all parts of the instrumentation. So for example, Ollie talked about using a moving bass line, so walking bass is typically associated with things like blues shuffle, but if you take a look at funk bassist Joe Dart, he is never sitting still. He doesn't just hold really long boring notes, he's always joining in with the melody, or again adding ghost notes with his right hand. He has very rhythmic bass lines. Stuff like drum fills, they might use a cheeky snare fill every so often, but it's not super massive tom fills and blast beats all over the place. It's just not part of the genre. There's nothing wrong with adding your own sound to a mix, but if you're aiming for a classic sound, you probably should look at what the classics did. So that actually brings us to the end of today's video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, maybe you've learned something new, and maybe it's even inspired you to go and write some of your own funky tunes, who knows. Massive thanks to Ollie, obviously he's been really important, I literally couldn't have done it without him, and he's actually written music for this channel before, so even if you haven't seen him, you will have definitely heard some of his stuff if you've watched my other videos. Please remember to like, share and subscribe as it would massively help the channel.